non-government youth-led non-for-profit, which aims to better connect young Australians and Indonesians to each other and to Australia-Indonesia related events. AIYA runs regular events, including language exchange, trivia nights, professional networking, sports events, and academic seminars like this one. I am very excited for this event. This history isn't commonly taught at schools, and I hope this event expands our understanding of Australia's history and the connection with Indonesia. I'll hand over to Kevin to introduce PPIA Victoria.
All right, thank you, Jesse. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Shalom, and Salam Kebajikan. My name is Kevin Feliciano, and I'm the External Vice President of PPI Victoria. So PPI Victoria is basically a student organization for Indonesian students who's in Victoria, and we host a lot of social events, a lot of corporate events and social impact events for us to basically hone our Indonesian Australian students to be a better version of themselves, basically. And I would like to say thank you for Ken Setiawan, Paul, and Aya for helping us create this event. This event won't be successful without you guys, and thank you for all of the audiences who joined our event. And yeah, and looking forward.
All right, thanks Kevin, and thanks Jesse. I'm now going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Paul Thomas, and you can already see a brief bio here on your screen, but I'll also read out another bio I have. So Paul Thomas is an affiliate researcher of Monash University. He's also teaching at La Trobe University. He has been a lecturer in Indonesian studies at various universities for over 20 years. Teaching, researching, and working to promote the study of Indonesian and Malay. He's also an experienced translator and has a strong background in historical research and has written historical biographies of Indonesians and Malays in Australia, and is currently researching representations of Indonesians and Malays in global cultures. So with that, I will hand over to Paul. Paul will speak for about 35 minutes, after which we will have some time for Q&A. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Ken. Now, I've just got to go into this share screen mode. That's it. Where is my advance? This just won't take me too long. Terrific. How are we going? Now, hopefully everyone can see me as well as my slides. Thumbs up, fantastic, terrific. And while we're on thumbs ups and what have you, look, you're not attending a lecture here. This is supposed to be a cultural week, and I've put this together in the spirit of that. So one of the problems for me is that I can't see you, or I only can get sort of pictures up and I'll be concentrating on my slides, etc. But please feel free to participate. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end of this, but also you can use emoticons, and also, like, if you find something funny, you can put a smiley face up or whatever. That would let me know that people are, that people are following it, and that it gives me a little bit more interaction. So yeah, go to town on those. Down on one of the selections, you'll have all sorts of claps and smileys, and you can do that during the presentation, just to help amuse ourselves, and also understanding that none of us are experts in this. And as you'll come to find out from my presentation, there are a lot of unanswered questions as we go into this. Starting with, you've got the discovery of Australia. I meant that as a kind of awkward title. Back in the days when I was at school, as we shall see, the idea of the discovery of Australia, that's just standard Australian history. But the word discovery has now become very contentious. And what people mean by discovery is not an easy thing to understand. But before we go into the presentation proper, I'm going to just see if my slides move across, or do I do this? I'm just trying, here we go. I'll try and get to the next slide. Okay, so I noticed that Ken has already given us our acknowledgement of country, but I thought I'd better do the one where I am. And since we're looking at these Indonesian connections, here it is in Indonesian. So basically, saya mengakui bangsa pertama yang berdaulat atas tanah dan perairan di tempat saya berada hari ini, suku Wurundjeri dari bangsa Kulin. Saya memberikan penghormatan kepada para tetua mereka pada masa lalu dan sekarang, dan untuk semua keturunan bangsa yang telah merawat tempat ini sejak penciptaannya. And there we have it. And of course, I've got the accompaniment of Bunjil, the creator spirit in the Wurundjeri people mythology or religion. So let's go and have a look. There's going to be a few embarrassing slides early on, so I'll just warn you. But here we start with. Now, I have to say, you might see a little bit of resemblance between me and this guy here. And that's me in school, very interested in Australian history, but already deciding that there were a lot of dodgy elements in what I was hearing in the classroom. And I did have questions for my teachers, because a lot of things didn't make sense. When we talked about discovery of Australia, it usually came up in the last couple of years of primary school or early high school, and there was a basic canon of explorers that we had to follow, whether they be Portuguese or Dutch or British or French. But one thing you didn't see, and that was Indonesians. They weren't there. In fact, no non-Europeans ever were mentioned in these lessons. And there's some of the books that go around, you can see from the 60s or the 50s, there wasn't really mention of anyone other than the European explorers. But this is definitely misleading, and hopefully that's part of the story that I'm going to tell, this story from my interest starting in school about this discovery of Australia. I wanted to know who were the first people who came here. I really wanted to know that. I wasn't sure whether the Spanish or the Portuguese, but I also found it very, very difficult to understand why it took them so long to find this rather huge continent in the southern half of Earth, of the planet. So it was a really strange story to me. There was also one other thing that got me wondering, as when we read the stories, we often found that when they arrived in the place, they talked to the local natives, but I never knew how they did that, because how did they know each other's language? How did they get this information? They would sometimes say, we talked to the natives and they told us this. It would be that sort of general idea in the books. Very, very strange. And so part of today is also answering that question. Okay, here is a schoolboy's timeline, basically of Australian history. Basically it was a lot, this is what we're talking about here is in popular culture. Just to avoid myself getting whipped here, but anyway, this is basically our understanding of Australian history in a nutshell when we were at school. But a long, long time ago, the Aborigines arrived. We didn't know when, but it was a long, long time ago, and then nothing happened. They did mention the Dutch, but that's only because, but they only came to Australia because it was an accident. They ploughed into the west side of the Australian continent as they were heading up to some other place. And I don't really remember them ever even mentioning the word Indonesian in these histories. After that, Captain Cook arrives, and it's like this big party. I was at school during the 1970s, so it was the bicentenary of Captain Cook's discovery of Australia, and people talked about the discovery of Australia by Captain Cook. The only problem is, as we go into the story, is that he, of course, didn't discover Australia, but I wasn't sure what they meant when they talked about the discovery of Australia. And then after that, the first fleet arrives, and I did do a test with one of my classes, and they had to do some presentations in Indonesian on Australian history. And it's amazing how many people actually didn't know who was the governor, the first governor in the colony of New South Wales, who came out on the first fleet. In fact, several of them mentioned Captain Cook. And that was indeed a little bit odd, but it shows you how shallow our understanding is of Australian history. It's still, even today, not a particularly popular history. So let's move on. And I found this quote. I talked about books from the 50s and the 60s, but I was quite interested in this book. It was a great little book, The Story of Australia, and it has little letters inside you can take out and you can explore this early history of Australia. And so I found that all fascinating, but yet it still seemed to follow a very familiar pattern. And as we see on the quote up here, they open their chapter on the voyages of Australia with this paragraph. The early Aboriginal settlers did not establish seafaring connections with their neighbours, and so Australia's development continued in isolation from the wider world. So that pretty well sidelined any role for Aboriginal people in this chapter. But then they went on further and said, while there may have been visits from Indonesian trading and fishing boats, the continent remained shrouded in mystery. So, I mean, you know, like may have, what did they mean by may have? Like that it wasn't actual factual? Definitely by 2008, we knew exactly that there were visits, not just visits, but an extensive relationship between North Australia and the Trepangas who came from various locations, particularly in eastern Indonesia. So it's interesting, but this person's building on that schoolboy, schoolgirl history books and just following a similar pattern, but making little improvements. So we do mention the Aboriginal people, and there is something about Indonesians, but it's still all a mystery, or it doesn't count very much. So what I was trying to understand what people mean when they say who discovered Australia, when they ask that question in terms not by historians, but in the general popular histories. And it seems that the first one that comes up is what they really mean is that it's who were the first non-Indigenous people. Yep, we know that we're Aboriginal people here, but who were the first non-Indigenous people to land in Australia, who recorded, and you know, they had to record their discoveries on maps, and this needed to lead to the settling of Australia. That's who they really wanted to know about when they asked about who discovered Australia. But there are other people who started to come up with this interest in when did Aboriginal people come to Australia, and isn't that really a discovery as well? So there are other people wondering about who discovered Australia in terms of the first people to arrive in Australia. And then there's sort of weird people like myself who are going, yes, okay, I definitely want to know about, you know, the Aboriginal arrival in Australia, but I also want to know about the who were the first non-Indigenous people to arrive in Australia. And that history still hasn't been written properly. Now, I have to admit, I'm trying to cover all my bases here, but there are, of course, people, I put a little note there, but you don't have to pay too much attention. You can't really read it anyway. But there are people who believe extraterrestrials did, in fact, beat everyone. But I'm going to put that aside and just go on with the main story. So one of the things that got to me as a kid in school was that we would hear these explorers on their way out to the East Indies. They come from the Pacific, they came from the Indian Ocean, but they couldn't find Australia, or they didn't find Australia. So starting with the Portuguese, and we know that the Portuguese had come from generally the West. That was because of a decision that was made to divide the spheres of influence between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Spanish ended up being given the Pacific, while the Portuguese were being given the Indian Ocean. So they came through the Indian Ocean, they came through the archipelago, the Indonesian archipelago, they got to eastern Indonesia, they got down to Timor, but then they stopped. And it just seemed a remarkable thing to me. What happened? Like, why didn't they keep going? There is no evidence whatsoever that the Portuguese ever came to Australia. So that was a bit of a mystery to me. I also knew that the Spanish sailed across the Pacific. So they are almost circumnavigating the world. They're coming halfway around the world. They're getting, in case of the Spanish, they make it to New Guinea. They sail around New Guinea, but they never come south. They never make it to Australia. So in terms of the European exploration, it was a really sort of puzzling idea, like there was some magic wall. And definitely nobody mentioned that the Indonesians who lived, while it was a substantial piece of water, I mean, I didn't understand why they couldn't come across either. So it was like a magic wall between Australia and the Indonesian archipelago. And we were supposed to believe that once the Aboriginal people had arrived in Australia, Indigenous people of Australia, then it was sealed off and no one came until. So let's quickly talk. I do want to quickly mention the Portuguese and their connection with Indonesia, because, or exploration as well, because it brings us to our first idea over here. Both sides of me now are Panglima Awang, or Panglima Awang Hitam. This is actually a fictional name. When I say a fictional name, the name came from a Malaysian writer who wanted to talk about the adventures of Henrik de Malaca, which is the Portuguese version. Now, why it's of interest to us is that these European ships of discovery, we think of being, the history is populated by Europeans, but the ships were often a mixed crew, and they brought crew on wherever they thought they needed to from many different locations or many different ports. It was a dangerous thing to sail across these very, very large oceans, and not a lot of people wanted to do it. But also, why would you not use the local knowledge? And most importantly, you would try and find an interpreter. And in this case, Ferdinand Magellan, in this expedition that went between 1519 and 1522, with the aim of circumnavigating the world for the first time, he arrives in Malaca and he seeks out an interpreter. And that interpreter ends up being a slave boy, which he buys. And he's now only known, well, in the books that we have, he only knows that he's only known as Henrik de Malaca, or sometimes Henry the Black in English. We do not know his original name, but he's only a boy of 14, and he then sails with Magellan as his interpreter. And this is also significant for us because it gives us an indication of how the Europeans viewed Malay, the language of Malay, as being a lingua franca across the archipelago that they could use to speak to anyone that they might come across. They weren't expecting necessarily fluent conversation, but they knew it was a useful language. This wasn't necessarily so, but according to the logs of Magellan, we know that they used Malay all the way through the archipelago, including in the Philippines. And it's interesting for me to try and speculate how that conversation would have gone, because the Philippines is not known for using Malay extensively. So while they never made it to Australia, it established Malay as a useful language when exploring this part of the world. There is one thing here also that even the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, put forward Panglima Awang, or Henry the Black, as the first person to circumnavigate the world. But as far as we know, there's no hard evidence of this, but it is quite likely that he was the first. The other small issue we have with him is that he's actually from Sumatra and not from Malacca. So this is a little bit of tension between Indonesia and Malaysia. He probably didn't spend that much time in Malacca. So this is what I meant about the idea of Malay being the language of explorers in this part of the world. So over here we have a map of the Malayo, which is another way the Europeans use the word Malay, Malayo language, and all the countries it was supposed to be spoken in. As you can see, it also includes the Philippines and the entire archipelago. In fact, it was also including the Indochina, or where we talk about Cambodia, and there's some evidence of Malay-speaking populations as part of the trade networks, traditional trade networks in that part of the world as well. I won't spend long on this, this particular character, but it was just to indicate that, yes, by about 1600, things are really happening for the Europeans. They are coming into the archipelago due to great competition for the spices that are found, particularly in eastern Indonesia. And so the Spanish want a bit of the action. But interesting enough, Torres also misses the east coast of Australia entirely. And that's in spite of the fact that he had sailed further south. And in fact, he had found the island of Vanuatu, which he called La Australia del Espirito Santo. And it's one of the first times that we see the word Australia being used. But he didn't really, well, because he cheated in terms of finding Australia, he just simply named Vanuatu as Australia. But Flinders will pick this up, and it's where we will get the name of the country that we are all in at the moment. I should say this line, which follows or hugs the New Guinea coast, has been disputed recently, and they think it may in fact have been further south than this line suggests, and that he may have caught sight of Cape York. People love to speculate about discoveries, particularly in popular history. It seems, you know, it is a big debate and people are really interested in it. Finally, after all these near misses, they finally have someone who lands in Australia, and that's Willem Yancy. And the thing I don't know, and I'm interested in, is his ship's crew. Not so much about Janssen. Yes, we can officially call him the first European that we have hard evidence of arriving in Australia, which he does in 1606. But what I'm interested in is crew. We know he loses a lot of crews, so he lands on the west side of Cape York, and they go almost immediately into a battle with the indigenous population there. And this becomes quite a theme. When we read about the explorers along the east coast, they don't seem to have the same clashes, regular clashes, as the people who are traveling on the north coast. And of course, I have a bit of a theory about this, is that it does suggest that they were more aware of an outside world, that they were more aware that they had something that they needed to protect. And it's reported back to the VOC that, in fact, that this is an area inhabited by savages, cruel black barbarians who slew some of our sailors. Okay. Now, while I've mentioned that he did land in Cape York, the thing is, he was a bit like Christopher Columbus. He didn't really know where he was. He assumed that Cape York was in fact part of New Guinea. So he never realized that he had discovered this southern continent. And then we come to an important one in our story. Again, people may have heard of Tasmania, named after Abel Tasman. And let me check. Oh, good. My spell check used to always change Abel Tasman's name to Able, as in to be able to do something, but it's kept it this time, which is good. Abel Tasman. So I'm interested in Abel Tasman, not because of Tasman. Lots of people have done that. But again, who was on board Tasman? One thing we know, he was directed. This is an exploration. It's not an accident that he is searching for this southern land or to look for the north coast of New Holland, but he is asked to go to the north coast of Australia, what we call New Holland, and he's ordered to take aboard Jan Jorrison, who is a Malay interpreter. So they decide, again, this is this importance, the idea of Malay being an important language to take for explorers. So here's a Malay interpreter, and then he's ordered to take a native from the Aru Islands. For us, or from Indonesia's discovery of Australia's point of view, this is the first hard evidence we have of an Indonesian coming to Australia, and that there were Indonesians aboard Alantasman's exploratory ships. What they plan to do with the language is hard to know. Sometimes they used what they call a chain interpreting. So the Malay interpreter would be used with the native from the Aru Islands, and the Aru Islands, a native would speak the other languages. And they hoped that those languages would serve them well for the area that they were exploring. Another method that explorers did is, if they couldn't communicate well, and unfortunately this goes on for some time, they kidnap one of the natives and they teach them the language, in this case Malay, or enough Malay so they can communicate with them. This happened even when they set up the colony in New South Wales in Sydney. So it's this idea of kidnapping. It's not surprising that they were met with hostility sometimes along the North Coast, but there are other reasons that may have occurred as well. And we start to get these books, of course, on the Malay language, which are produced, and this one's translated into English and Malay. So by the 1600s, we've got these early explorers taking into account this widespread use of Malay. And this is also of interest to me for anyone who's been to Perth. Willem The Valming is really well known. He's got a statue there in Perth because he is the first person to explore the Swan River. And that's all very interesting and a bit of European history. But on board, he had at least 3 what they called Indians from the Cape of Good Hope. And these were Malay speakers. Again, what he intended to do with the Malay speakers, we're not sure, but in the Cape of Good Hope, current day South Africa, there was a large population of Malays which had been transported there by the Dutch. It was part of this trade link all the way back to the Netherlands. So again, a very early indication of the possible use of Indonesians. And that's pretty well wraps up, but I want to go further back because what I want to answer is that one of the questions I wanted to answer, was what about the non-European discovery of Australia? And this has become more and more interesting, and it is now being incorporated increasingly into school curriculum. And when I say that, I don't mean just over the last 10 years, but there are moves over the last 12 months now to increase this understanding the position of the Indigenous people in Australia, and understanding sort of more of a history, because it wasn't a static history. So we know that approximately 65,000 years ago, this is according to some current theories, is that they entered through Indonesia, or the Indonesian archipelago, to New Guinea, so over first to New Guinea, but the other way was via Timor, and that there possibly were these 2 paths to Australia through the Indonesian archipelago. Now, the question was after that, was that the end of it? Why didn't more people come? Why wasn't there a constant migration of people through the archipelago into Australia? Well, one of the reasons is that we found that sea levels rose and the gaps between those islands increased considerably. Of course, all this area here is flooded, and New Guinea was separated from Cape York, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why there was no further contact. But to think of it as a more extreme position is to think of, well, there was no more contact until those Europeans arrived. But there are problems with that idea. And let's have a look at this first one, the dingo. If Australia was isolated for most of that 65,000 years, how did the dingo get here? And this brings us into the first real evidence that there must have been some contact, and we don't know whether it was continuous or whether it was sporadic, but probably sporadic, with Indonesia well after those sea levels had dropped away. And some of the most recent research shows us that the dingo did indeed come from Indonesia, and they've gone even further, these particular researchers from Griffith University, and think that the dingo came from a particular people, the Polynesian people from Sulawesi. So it's our first contact with Sulawesi, and they've done this quite ingeniously by looking at the DNA, by looking at the fact that the dingo isn't able to digest starch very well. So they've assumed that it's going to, well, they've built up an argument that it's come from a non-agricultural population. And we know at this time there were non-agricultural populations who were able to move across, who were seafaring as well, and were able to move across the archipelago, and that it's likely that that they came as far south as the Australian continent. Also, they know that they probably originally got the dogs from Kalimantan. And the dog here, this imposter over here on the, if I can just bring myself over here. So this is a bit of an imposter over here. So it's actually not a dingo, but it's a dog, a wild dog with the Iban people in Kalimantan. And you can see that the features are very, very similar. But this has puzzled people for a long time because it really eroded the idea that Australian Indigenous people had to be isolated. Another good candidate for non-European discovery of Australia were the Polynesians, but they followed a similar pattern to the Europeans in the sense of they were great navigators. They traversed the Pacific, reaching the Hawaiian Islands all the way around to New Zealand, but they appear never have made it to Australia. And that is also a bit of a mystery to me, that people could travel in the entire Pacific and then not arrive in the largest land that is in the Pacific, which is Australia. Now, if we go forward a little bit into 1770 with Captain Cook, one of the reasons we know that there was no contact, or one of the things that suggests that there was no contact between the Polynesians and Indigenous Australians, was that on board Captain Cook was an interpreter, and the interpreter known as Tupaya. He was also a navigator, and it meant that Tupaya was used throughout the Pacific as an interpreter. So when he moved from, he was of Tahitian origin, and when he moved to New Zealand, Tupaya could still communicate with the Maori in New Zealand. That the languages weren't the same, but they were familiar enough for him to communicate. And this gave him incredible prestige in his journeys with Cook around New Zealand. And of course, it was a huge advantage to Cook because they were able to gather information about sources and generally be assisted by Maori people. It also provided a cultural bridge between the British sailors and the Maori people. Now, what happens is that Tupaya goes along with Cook all the way through to the Eastern Australia. When he arrives in Eastern Australia, he is given the job to be interpreter at first, but he can't make any use of his language. It completely breaks down. He has no knowledge of it, and he seems disorientated. In fact, as they sail up the coast, he loses his prestigious role on board because he no longer is able to navigate and he's no longer able to use his language. So it's quite interesting. He falls into a bit of a depression, it would seem. And unfortunately, when they arrive in Batavia, which is where they go to immediately after Australia, many of the ship's crew die. They get dysentery and various other health issues, and this includes Tupaya, who is also very, very sick in Batavia, and he also loses his companion, Tayata, who was a young boy who had come along with Tupaya and who Tupaya had been teaching. Tupaya was known as a priest amongst his people, and he had been passing knowledge on to Tayata, and when he dies, Tupaya himself falls further into depression and eventually passes away. The only other thing that Cook does in Batavia is he does put together a list of Malay words and follows that tradition of Malay being considered an important language for the explorers. It was also interesting that he was, if we just look at the picture up here on the left-hand side of my shoulder, these are pictures that Tupaya did himself of Aboriginal people on the east coast of Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of Tupaya, which is most unfortunate. So he has now become a very popular figure in New Zealand and in the South Pacific, and has emerged in popular culture in a myriad of different ways. There's an example there of The Adventures of Tupaya, which is a recent award-winning book.
Paul, you have just over 2 minutes remaining.
How long did we have? Was that 40 minutes?
35.
Oh,
but I'm sure it's okay if you want to go for, it's okay if you want to go on for a bit longer.
It's not, okay. Yeah, I was planning about 40 minutes, but it's okay. Okay, and now putting the Polynesians aside, we have the Melanesians, and of course the Melanesians are closer than anyone else, including, sometimes we say Indonesia is our closest our neighbour, but in reality it is New Guinea who is our closest neighbour, and they have things to sell. They've got pots, and you can see them over here. These pots are produced en masse, and they actually trade with them. And we know that there's shards of these pots have been found in the Torres Strait Islands. So we know that they came as far south of the Torres Strait Islands, but we don't know, and we have no hard evidence of them landing on mainland Australia. Just to have a look, they had substantial watercraft boats. These weren't just little canoes they were travelling in. So they were quite substantial, quite interesting. This brings us to the Indonesians themselves. And I always wanted to be on an Indonesian stamp, and this is my opportunity. It's only a 1500 rupiah stamp, but that'll do. And what we have here is an interesting map. It's from a book that was published in the 1960s, and it shows the Goa Sultanate, including Northern Australia, and it even puts a date on Northern Australia as coming into or recognising the Sultanate's sovereignty as 1640. Now, this does correspond to the period in which the Goa Sultanate, based in South Sulawesi, was at its height, most notably led by Sultan Hasanuddin. And you will see the Sultan Hasanuddin's name all over the place in Makassar, including their leading university there. But the problem with the map is that there is no primary source. No one's ever found something that came from the 1600s or the 1700s that justified the drawing of this map. But we know that around this time that the Goa Sultanate definitely had the ability. They were trading heavily into Timor and in search of sandalwood, which was an extremely important trade item. And they had fleets that sailed all around eastern Indonesia. And I do find it almost impossible to believe that they didn't come as far south as Australia, either by accident or in search of things such as sandalwood or beeswax, which would have been important resources. So the other thing is that sometime, we don't know again when, before 1750s, they knew that in the waters of Australia was a thing called trepang. Now, we know that it only started, the industry only started in the 1750s because that's when the trade started with China. And this has been discussed quite in depth in a number of publications. But the Indonesians must have been there beforehand in order to know about the trepang that was there. So just in case people haven't, I don't know how many people have eaten this trepang. I have tried it on a few occasions, and it really depends on how it's cooked. You've got to have a good cook. It's not the most beautiful creature in the world, unfortunately. It comes in a few different colours and sizes, but it was considered a delicacy through China, and it wasn't eaten by Indigenous Australians, nor was it eaten by Indonesians. So it was purely for the China trade. There were two routes that they came down from Sulawesi. So if we look at the map here, one came to what they called Merege, which was the northeast coast of Arnhem Land, and the other one to Kayu Jawa, which was the west or the northwest of Australia. But it's Merege that they have the most intensive relationship with. There's also another route on this map, which I found quite interesting, going via Madura. Now there's a little message that's that's right. So I'm going to keep going. One of the things we talked, maps were so important when people are talking about discovery, and they sort of said, well, the trepangers didn't have maps. But this is probably distorting the truth as well, because they clearly had mental maps. They clearly wrote. We know that they also made notes, written notes about new discoveries that they made. And they also named parts of the geography as they sailed along the coast. So the idea that they aren't explorers, I find really difficult to accept. And here are a few names that are still around. These were used well into the 19th century, and some are still used today. And some come from Makassar, some are related to Malay, but they clearly show that the trepangers knew exactly where they were and had a relationship to place both through the written word and through oral tradition. I'm just going to jump ahead because I'm conscious of the time. Look, the Europeans did try to get in on this act. Here they came and set up various forts, but they were supposedly set up to take part in the trepang industry, but other people now argue that a lot of it was to stop Dutch or French intrusion. And once that job had been done, these forts, these settlements were closed down and didn't continue. That's all I want to say basically about that. The reason they were able to start these industry or propose these settlements was through the meeting that happened between Captain Flinders and the trepang captains. And this was enabled by a sailor on board, a Javanese sailor, we think, and probably from Cape Town, that he took on board Cape Town because Flinders didn't go to Batavia before he headed around Australia. Now, we know the name of the man, the interpreter, and his name was Williams, and sometimes you'll see Abraham Williams, though we don't have any primary source for that. So he was called upon by Williams to negotiate with the captains of the praus. Bangari was also taken on board in Port Jackson in Sydney as an interpreter, but his language wasn't much use as soon as they got more than about 100 kilometres out of Sydney. But he ended up being a useful cultural interpreter, using hand gestures and being able to be intermediary between the Europeans and Aboriginal populations. So I'm really coming to the end now, because this is a nice segue, hopefully, to Bu Lily's presentation, which is tomorrow, where she'll be talking more about this trepang connection. Fundamentally, the person who is of most interest to us was the Nakoda Pobaso. Pobaso, I'm using the spelling of the Makassar or the Bugis spelling. I'm just using the spelling that was used by Flinders. And he's the man that they get immense amount of information from, and gives Flinders an outline of the industry. He's shocked, of course. Flinders he thought they were pirates, and he's shocked to know that there were other people, non-Europeans, in Australia at this time. And Porbasso had been coming to Australia since the 1780s. So he'd been well familiar with the North Coast and was a wealth of information, stayed over 2 days on the boat. Going back to that earlier quote that I talked about where Indigenous people didn't engage with this seafaring, these maritime explorations, is the interesting photos that came to light, which were from which were from the 1870s in Makassar, which were photos of Aboriginal people, probably Yolngu people, who were in Makassar and had come along with the Trepangas back to Makassar. So we were not talking about a simple trade here, but in the end, it was something that was much more extensive. And these are the people who were probably the primary interpreters, the primary people who engaged with the Trepangas, because they would have been the most fluent in the language. What we have left of the language is very little, but there's still a number of vocabulary that we can see within the Yolngu Mata language. Mata is tongue, Yolngu is the particular clan or the nation that is in, I'm just in the way here, is in this green area here. And this is the area of most intensive concentration with the Trepangas. They came all along this coast, but we know they had a much more tenuous relationship in what was called Kayu Jawa. So I will finish here with, just as I said, this little segue to Bu Yuli's presentation tomorrow, that this connection with the Trepangas and with Indonesia in general is still celebrated quite a lot. And it was, even though the trade finished in 1906, it appeared in their stories, in their artwork. Here on the left-hand side is something from the 1940s, and on the right-hand side, you have things as recent as 2019, 2020. This is from an exhibition that was in the Victorian National Art Gallery. There was quite a lot of works there. And each time they do these works, as I said, they're very much reviving or continuing something that's never been disconnected, but reinvigorating the stories that occurred between the Trepangas and the Yolngu people. I'm just going to jump over that one. So, as I said, I'll just finish there. There's lots of questions that I'm curious about. This is something I'm just exploring at the moment, so I decided I would do this with your group. And thank you for that opportunity. It's been great to just test a few things out here. But you know, we know that Indonesia has always been an important pathway to Australia through its history. But we don't know what the extent of this exchange was. We know a bit about the language, for instance, coming into the Yolngu language, but we don't know the other way around. There must have been words that travelled from Northern Australia into Makassar languages as well. We also know that Indonesians have played an important part in the European exploration of Australia, that those ships carrying Dutch flags often had Indonesian crews. And I've got a very good example of that happens in the 1790s in Sydney, but that's another story. So Ken, I'll hand it back. Sorry, I was a little bit longer than you expected, but hopefully there's a couple of questions.
Thanks so much, Paul, for a very fascinating talk. I don't think anyone minds it was a bit longer. It was really very interesting, and I loved hearing more about these deep and long historical connections between what we now call Australia and Indonesia, obviously. So I'd like to, we've got about 10 minutes, just over 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, could you please raise your virtual hand? And you can also put them in the chat box. And actually, Paul, while you were talking, the first question came in from Matthew, and I will just read Matthew's question out. And Matthew's question is, wouldn't Ferdinand Magellan, the owner of Henry the Black, along with the rest of the crew of the ship, also be the first people to circumnavigate the Earth? Why is it only Henry that's regarded as the first person to do that?
Well, Henry comes up, his position is mainly promoted by the Malaysians, I should say, but there is some historical connection to that. So we don't know if he actually made it. It is possible that he did. Now, I was just foregrounding, putting Henry the Black to the foreground. In this case, there were some other survivors, but the vast majority of the crew died, and they had to take on new crew where they could. And that's one of the reasons that Henry stands out, or Panglima Awang stands out. It's interesting to me that he hasn't been celebrated that much in Indonesia, given that he was from Sumatra.
Thank you, Paul.
Great, thank you, Paul. I'm just looking at whether there are any hands up. I can't see a hand up, but actually, there is a question from Fiona. Could you say a little bit more about Panglima Awang?
Well, because we know so little about him, what's happened is a lot of fiction has grown around him. As I said, there was a Malaysian writer who's written a couple of books actually about him. And so I think that, well, one of the things I didn't say is that although he was taken on as a slave originally, that Magellan actually guarantees his freedom in his will, and for his services, and he's granted that freedom. He wasn't a sort of an important figure. He was known about, but he wasn't an important figure probably until around the 70s, where his name started to be talked about a lot more. And this was partly to do with Malaysian nationalism as well in its history, looking for these people who, explorers are interesting. They go to places which they are totally unfamiliar with. They are adventurous people. They are open culturally. So it's natural that that people want to find explorers from their own culture. And I think Panglima Awang, or Henry the Black, is symbolic of that, that Malaysians were also out there waiting to explore the world, or Malays, I should say, were ready to explore the world, or willing to explore the world.
Thanks, Paul. Just another question in the chat from Shiha Sarahil. I would like to ask, was there any other seafaring people from Indonesia other than the Makassar people that visited Australia?
Yes, well, first of all, I think that those people who came from the Sultanate of Goa, it's only speculation that they came south. But we also know of another people, according to Yolngu tradition and other nations along the north coast, which referred to the Baini people. Some people suggest that these may have been the sea gypsies of Indonesia. And the distinction they made was said, well, these are not the same as the Trepangers. Trepangers came, they were only men that came, because that had problems, and relations between the two groups were often fired up between the Trepangers and their search for Aboriginal women. But the difference between them and the Baini is that they brought women with them, and they were families that came across. And there are various geographical features which are named after the Baini women in Northern Australia. Some of this appears to be myth, but of course myth always has a little element of truth in it. And we do know from the rock, Campbell McKnight, who did so much on the Trepangers, is always very keen to point out that it's really the 1750s that this trade starts. That Trepangers coming out before the 1750s is not correct, but it gets mixed up because clearly there's evidence that Indonesians were in Northern Australia before then. And I'm not going back to the Dingo now, but I'm talking about the 1600s and possibly 1500s. And we know that because we've dated rock art in Northern Australia, which depicts Indonesian-like vessels, and those dates seem to be fairly certain, and they occurred before this 1750s period. And so they almost definitely are not trait owners. Notice how I get out of that, by the way, almost definitely.
Yeah. Paul, there's actually quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go through them in the order that they've come in. So the next question is from Stella. Do we know if there's much recorded history around the interactions between people from PNG and Indigenous people?
Look, sometimes in Australia, we're really concerned about Indonesian studies and the plight of Indonesian studies and the way the numbers have gone down. But there are people, sadly, in worse situation than us, and that's people working in Pacific studies and working in New Guinea. Now, New Guinea, as I said, is our nearest neighbour, but it really, we don't study any New Guinea languages, for example, so there's no way that we do that. And so the number of people working in this area is very, very small. But it's quite heartening to see some of this research, and I've been to a couple of seminars recently pointing out these connections. Like I had never seen a ship like that till fairly recently. I don't want to call it a canoe or boat. I guess the one that I showed you, the Melanesian one. I mean, that was right in Port Moresby, or around the area of where Port Moresby is, which is, there's just an island path to Northern Australia from there. So the bottom line is we don't know very much information, but recent research suggests through these clay potteries and broken pieces of pottery that are in the Torres Strait that clearly there was interaction. We also know in modern day Torres Strait that there are many people in the Northern Islands which still have connections with southern New Guinea. And this goes back a very long way.
Thanks, Paul. I think throughout your presentation, I'm really struck by, on one hand, the things that we don't yet know or not yet know, but also that if we dig a little bit further, if we start questioning actually what we know and how we know it, that we can actually find, I think, a more richer and diverse history that really also, in my opinion at least, also kind of repositions Australia within the region. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that. And just another question is, I hope it's okay that we just take a few more minutes because there's so many good questions and I don't think that we'll be able to get through them all. But a question from Jeffrey, speaking about the Malays, is there a community of Malay in Australia's external territory, such as there is a community of Malay in Australia's external territory, such as the Cocos and Keeling Islands and Christmas Island? Are they mainly seafarers too?
Right. The people in the Cocos Islands and Christmas Island are kind of remnant Malay communities from the 19th century, and they were brought there usually for agriculture rather than being sailors themselves. In fact, across Northern Australia in the 19th century, there were what we call these Malay towns, or Kampung Melayu. You found them in places like Broome, in Darwin, across to Cairns, and some of that heritage is still there. So right across there, but many of them intermarried with both Indigenous people or non-Europeans. So if you were to go to the town in Broome, or if you go to the Malay town in Cairns, it wouldn't just be Malays who were there. Unlike the Japanese town or the China town, the Malay towns seemed to be anyone else who was left over. The Malays founded them and they started them, and little bits of Malay language were still there, but generally they were mixed communities, and all those communities have pretty well died out. There's some people who can trace their ancestry back there. But the Cocos Islands and Christmas Islands we still have, and they weren't maritime people, but brought over for agriculture.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to ask one final question that was sent directly to me by Jessie. What do you think, and I think this is a really good question to end with, is what do you think the implications of this discovery of connections between Australia and Indonesia would mean in terms of national identity if it were to be commonly taught at schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this whole exploration of Chinese history in Australia, of Indonesian history in Australia, is part of reflecting who we are as a people now. It's really a bit surprising to people in the way that it was cut out of history when we looked at it back in those old school books. We didn't see it as particularly important, but finding these people, whether it be like Abraham, the fact that there was an Indonesian Javanese getting on board Matthew Flinder's ship, which is an iconic voyage, in 1800 in Sydney, like this surprises people. And it was an important voyage and he had an important role. But it helps us reorientate ourselves away from perhaps people who we would never were. Australia was never a British nation. It was never in the sense of the people who inhabited the continent. It was always diverse, but that diversity has become more important as we've allowed a more equal approach to our society, whether it's through work or all the things that we do. And there's an expectation that we will represent all of the society, not just a narrow slice of it. So I think it's really important. It helps us to understand who we are, but it also helps us to know where we are in the world. The reason these connections can continually be found is because we were right next to Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and they were always going to have some influence on us.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a really important message and a wonderful message to end this session with. Thank you so much for your talk, your insights. I've learned a great deal, and I've really found it very fascinating, and yeah, also highlighting a really important way of looking at Australia and Indonesia's relations and our place in the world. Now, before I hand over to Kevin, I think the idea is also that we're taking a group photo. So Kevin, can I just hand over to you to organize that? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So can all you turn on your camera so we can take a picture together?
So Paul, would you ever please stop screen sharing to make it easier?
Yes, I thought so. That's what I'm just
and
to do.
And if you're not comfortable turning on your camera, that's perfectly fine as well.
Hang on, where do I stop sharing screen? I'm down with share screen. Advanced options.
I'll just stop it for you.
Oh, there you go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, I've got snipping tool all ready to go. All right. Okay. I'll count down. Okay, 3, 2, 1. And okay, I've taken it. I'll take one more. Just let me save it first. Right. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Ken, for being able to support this event. We have a voucher for you on behalf of PPI Victoria and AIYA, and also for the audiences, we have another future events that the speaker will be Lily and Vanessa. So we're gonna talk more about like Makassar and talk about like Jamu making workshop, which will be fun. And for those of you who haven't registered, just register through either PPIA or AIYA's link. And yep, is there any other words from AIYA?
All right, I was just sending the credit, but yeah, that was all. Thanks. Thank you so much again, Paul, and thank you again to PPI for working with us. And I'm really happy how this event turned out for our first session, and looking forward to tomorrow's session.
Thank you. Thank you to all the committee. Thank you, Ken, for hosting. Right. I hope the president, I wasn't sure of this floating head. I felt like something out of Harry Potter with my head floating around the slides. Was it headless somebody, Nick? And hopefully that was still effective.
It's a very great presentation. Before this, I didn't even know that there's Indonesian background in Australia, and it's quite interesting that even in Indonesian schools they don't really teach you about this. And yeah, I agree with you that they should nudge more, tell more of a history in Australian schools as well as Indonesian schools. So yeah, because if you know the past, it's like the better prepared you are for the future. So hopefully they'll teach us soon, for us to become more aware of it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Ken. Appreciate your contributions in today's event.
It was really great, Paul. Thank you.
Yes, and I do understand when we get over this lockdown that AIYA participants are going to come over to Footscray